That guest is civil rights lawyer and co-founder of the Ramey Law PC in Los Angeles, Christa Ramey. Thank you for joining us. Let's just jump right into this because it's so much to tackle. Can you talk about the challenges of finding an impartial and diverse jury in such a high-profile case like this?
I think that that's a tall order in this case. I think that we've seen a lot of lessons of this in the past, where trying to find an impartial jury is almost impossible when it comes to convicting a cop, as well. We had a horrible example of that in the Rodney King trial here in Los Angeles, where the trial was moved to a predominantly white, police bedroom community to be tried. God knows why. Here you're in you want to have a jury of your peers in the community in which it happened. And so rightfully, they've kept this case here, and I think that that's good. But people have very strong views one way or the other about this case. And that played out all the way through the presidential election, even in this country. So it's going to be a very challenging task to find jurors that don't have very strong opinions about what happened last summer.
With that being said, considering the fact that they've already chosen 6 jurors, do we think that we could hit a speed bump, or is it really that challenging for this court?
No, I don't think that we're hitting a speed bump. I think that the jury is being selected pretty quickly. They're letting a lot of jurors go, and there's been a lot of challenges for cause granted, and I think that that's understandable. I'm really curious as to what happened this morning when we went off and a juror. So, there was obviously something very sensitive discussed during that period of time. I don't think we're hitting speed bumps. I just think it's going to be a slow, arduous process.
Got it. And I have to ask you, if Derek Chauvin, do we believe, better yet, is he expected to testify in his own trial?
I would never expect a defendant to testify.
Why?
I don't think he will in this case. Well, it's always because it could bring out so much more. You don't know what's going to happen as a criminal defense attorney. To put your client on the stand, you're waiving your right to self-incrimination. It allows the police to go into, or the prosecution rather, to go into all sorts of areas where you might not know or what your client might say. And if your client has a temper or isn't a likable person to begin with, then that could end up backfiring as well. You don't see very often criminal defendants testify on their own behalf. The defense does not have to do anything. They don't have to put on a single witness. In fact, it's the prosecution's burden of proof. So, you just don't see it happen very often.
What if the prosecution called for him to testify? Is that an option?
No, never an option. In fact, that would be the cause for an immediate mistrial. Because of a defendant's constitutional right not to testify at trial, the prosecution cannot shine a light or comment on the fact that he did not take the stand, and by calling him, that would do exactly that.
So if he's not expected to testify, who is?
There's a list of about 500 witnesses, I think, in this case. You cannot call the other police officers as well. I know that the people that had the video cameras.
But would those other officers,
cell phone cameras,
I'm sorry to cut you off. Would those other officers be called in to testify if they have a trial coming up in August?
They cannot be called to testify for the same reasons that Derek Chauvin cannot be called to testify. You're going to get bystanders testifying. You're going to have a family member testify to what's called a spark of life evidence in Minnesota. That means that someone can be called to testify on behalf of the Floyd family, to testify about Mr. Floyd's life and the impression that it made upon the world. And it's a very limited testimony, but you will have that as well. In addition to coroner will be testifying as to cause of death. You'll have expert witnesses testifying as to chokehold training techniques that were used in this particular case, and whether or not those were in violation of any police policy. And I think you're going to have dueling experts on that potentially.
And you mentioned the coroner also being one of those people to testify. Now, the court actually threw out the family's autopsy. So what does that mean for this case? Because the family's autopsy had basically said that George Floyd died from that knee on his neck. Didn't mention anything about what the state's autopsy did.
The state's autopsy also mentions asphyxiation as a cause of death secondary to a chokehold. So it's a perfectly acceptable report. The report itself will not come into evidence. It's what's considered to be hearsay evidence. It'll be the coroner who testifies as to his findings. The reason why that was tossed out, and I don't think that the prosecution really fought too hard on it, is because it was subject to cross-examination. It could be considered to be bias, and because the coroner that was utilized, the county coroner's office report is sufficient in terms of its cause of death finding, it wasn't necessary to have that additional. In fact, would be duplicative.
Thank you for clearing that up, Christa. That's exactly why we have you as a guest. And you mentioned your impression earlier of the case. What's your impression of the jury selection so far?
I think you've got a good jury so far. The jury selection process is terrifying to me as a trial lawyer to do it this way, because you don't get the opportunity to question multiple jurors at the same time. That's a good way to be able to draw out biases that you get in normal jury selection. People will feel comfortable then revealing themselves to you if they hear other people doing it. And in this case, because it's that one-on-one, I think it's a little scarier for the jurors, and so they're a little bit more guarded with their information. So, it has to be done this way, because of COVID, because of the publicity in this case. I think a number of reasons that they've chosen to do it this way, but it's interesting to watch, to say the least, as a lawyer.
And Christa, outside of what you've already mentioned, what stands out to you as a trial lawyer in this case?
I will tell you that both sides are very prepared. We're witnessing some incredible trial advocacy so far. The way that the attorneys are able to get jurors off for cause. You're seeing challenges being made by the prosecution because of the propensity to strike people of color from this jury. It's interesting to see how that will play out. You mentioned earlier there's not one Black woman yet on the jury. There is, I think, a woman that described herself as multiracial. I don't know what that means for her identification, but I'd like to see a diverse jury. I think that a diverse jury is important in this case, to have the community feel that there was a fair trial, no matter what the outcome.
Anything else? Actually, I have another question for you. What do you, moving on outside of this case, what do you make of this new LAPD report alleging misconduct in the handling of the Black Lives Matter protests after the death of George Floyd? And what impact do you think, if any, it would possibly have on this case?
Well, it's not going to have any impact on this case. I think that it has an impact on public opinion in general. For those of us that have lived in Los Angeles for any period of time, I don't think that we're surprised by this report at all. For those of us that work in the civil rights field in general as well, the LAPD is notorious. Certain divisions more notorious than others for how they handle protests, how they handle racially charged protests, how the disparity between how Black and white individuals are treated when interacting with the police. So it's not a surprising report at all to me, and it's something that was witnessed in the news regularly during this summer. You didn't have to have a report tell you what you saw with your own eyes.
Good point. Any other last-minute thoughts that you want to share with our audience, whether it be about the Black Lives Matter protests, this new report coming out about LA, which New York also released one this past summer, or just about the George Floyd case and what we can expect in the coming days?
I think we had good news yesterday with the inclusion of the third-degree murder charge. I think that almost assuredly, in my view, assures a conviction of Derek Chauvin, which I think will then cause probably plea deals to be made with the other police officers. I think that that inclusion of that charge gave me great comfort, and I think that you'll probably see that one be the one that the jury hangs their hat on as well.
Can you elaborate on that?
So jurors oftentimes are making compromises when they're in deliberations. They're not making, there's always differing or diverging views. So you'll have a camp that will be really in favor of the least amount of charges and a camp that wants to, have the first degree and it's not even available. So jurors make compromises in jury deliberation all the time. And if left with a second degree murder charge, in this case, it's going to be very difficult for the prosecution to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. It's going to be very tricky. And a manslaughter charge, I think, would cause anger, quite frankly, among the community at large. And I think these jurors are going to be acutely aware of the impact of what they decide. And
Absolutely.
I think that inclusion is why that's important here. You're going to get something that will be a little bit more comforting in terms of a verdict for the community.
Christa Ramey, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight and we look forward to welcoming you back on BNC Live.
Thank you so much.
And our special coverage of George Floyd's death